How's it going, everyone? It is I, Anime Outlet, and this is part 3 of What If Deku Had King's Powers. And now, before we begin, I would just like to ask you all to please consider subscribing. It really does help this channel out. So now, let's begin. How can we just let two of these highly valued criminals just escape from our hands right when we had them right in our grasp? Look, All Might, sometimes things like this can happen. We're not immune to other people's quirks, especially if they're outside the premises. All Might would slam his hands down onto the table in frustration. Now these students have 1 month off, and these villains are still out there lurking around in the real world. Who knows what could happen to the students if they're out there? Maybe the villains might coordinate an attack on each one of them individually while they're outside of our protection. You know, that does actually have quite a good point, All Might, Nezu would say towards the shiny yellow figure. Perhaps we should have more security systems. Yes, especially after this attack on campus. And in addition to that, we can add dorm rooms, just as another added level of security for the students. As if one were to die, that would be horrible for us along with the family, while also for our just reputation, indeed. Nezu would be saying this, sort of mumbling to himself, as All Might would just get up and leave, just leaving Nezu to basically just talk to himself for another hour over what security measures need to be added to the campus. As Izuku would be sitting in his room, he would end up be thinking what would end up happening in a month when he gets back from UA. As he knew in around 5 months or so he had the sports festival. However, interrupting his train of thought, his father would end up walking in, yelling at him that he needs to go train, as the UA Sports Festival had been jumped forward to be the day right when all of the UA students come back from their break, giving all of them a month to train their absolute hardest. So with that, Izuku and all of them would end up basically train for this month, having been told through email and all these other things that the sports festival was happening. We fast forward that month as we now end up seeing Izuku and all of his class walking into the UA Sports Festival Coliseum. All of them would stare up at the blinding lights blaring down at them before looking up towards the stands that were completely packed, as the stadium had completely sold out within minutes of offering tickets. All of them would look up, marveling at how many people before Izuku would be called to the stand, being the first-year representative, as well as also being All Might's son. As Izuku would walk up there, he would wish everybody luck, causing the crowd to cheer, which would signify the start of the games. So the first event would be a race, which Izuku, like this, would end up walking up to the starting line, stretching out for a moment before he would end up hearing the just sound of go being yelled over just a massive speaker. Izuku, hearing this, would instantly rush off, but would know that this race would most likely just be sort of a placement thing. There's going to be a certain number of people that are allowed to continue on, and seeing that there's around 200 first years competing, there's likely only going to be around 1/4 of that, so around 50 people are going to make it. So all he has to do is make it in the top 50, preferably top 15, just in case there's any added things to placement. So Izuku, knowing first place, if there was anything added, would give him a strategic disadvantage. He would end up going into this race and would end up making it to the finish line, waiting for a few people to pass him. These being having like Momo and Ida end up passing him, which Izuku would walk into the finish line getting 5th place. For just getting 5th place, when in reality he could have gotten anywhere from 1st to 3rd. So with Izuku passed, we now end up going to the cavalry battle, where Izuku So learning that they do have a point system, and in fact, since he didn't go for first place, he now had the luck of not being stuck with a 10 million point headband. So with Izuku now not having that fabled 10 million point headband, he would end up being able to just gather a team so much quicker. So Izuku would end up going around gathering up his team, where he would just asking them all, hey, do you want to be on my team? He would go to Uraraka, Izumi, and he would go to Uraraka, Izumi, and Ida, all of them joining him, as Izumi, who had gotten around 7th, as the strategy Izuku had used in canon didn't work this time due to Izuku being there, blocking out the path she used. So because of this, she would only get around 7th, not having the 10 million point headband that Bakugo now has. So with the start of the cavalry battle, Izuku end up cracking his fingers before looking around, knowing he has to get at least 300 point headbands or so. However, with the combined total of his team, all of them who had placed top 20, 2 of them in fact getting, or 3 of them in fact getting top 10, they were pretty well set off, but a couple more headbands wouldn't hurt their goal of making it to the 3rd and final round. So Izuku would end up looking around, yelling for Ida to rush in a straight line, where they would doing so as Chastful would end up flying around, snagging ribbons off of people's heads, bringing them right back to Izuku, and snatching them and putting them onto his head. Right as this would happen, Bakugo would come flying out of nowhere with a glare on his face, with an evil, devilish smile looking down onto Izuku and his ribbons. Reaching forward, he would grab a couple of them, tugging on them, for Chastful would come out of nowhere, slamming its sharp point right into Bakugo's cheek, piercing right through it, sending him flying into one of the end walls, where another team would come in, snagging the 10 million point headband right off of Bakugo's head. This battle for the 10 million point headband would continue further, as Izuku's team would get around 3rd place in the cavalry battle, securing their spot in the 3rd and final event, while Bakugo would have to be carted off towards Recovery Girl's office before he could take part in the 3rd event, as his team had managed to recover the 10 million point headband, as he still had that gaping hole right in his cheek, revealing all of his teeth and his mouth. So as Bakugo would get patched up, the first match would end up being announced, Izumi and Izuku. This match would go basically just like normal, as Izumi would end up getting brainwashed, but would end up coming out on top of the victory. However, Todoroki in fact would be in the other opposite bracket from Izumi, rather being in Bakugo's bracket instead of hers, meaning Suro would get past the first round and would end up facing off against Izumi, where Izumi would quickly take care of Suro, and with one flick, Suro would be out of the arena, giving Izumi just a path to the semi-finals, where she would end up meeting Izuku, who would end up easily taking care of his first 2 opponents, being Ida and Mei Hatsume, as his fight against Ida would go short and quick, as Ida would end up rushing towards Izuku. Chastful would turn into a massive guardian, blocking all of Ida's attacks, before with its 4 limbs grabbing on to Ida's legs, grabbing on, allowing for Ida to not move a single muscle, basically completely subduing him before Izuku would walk up, knocking him out. And because Mei Hatsume really had no intentions of making it to the finals, she would only just show off her gadgets, which Izuku would allow her to do, being just such a kind heart that he was. So with Izuku now having a clear path to the semi-finals, he would be facing off against his father's successor, Izumi Midoriya. As Izuku would stare off right towards her. The match would begin. She would end up using her legs, propelling herself forward towards him, flicking her fingers towards Izuku. However, the Guardian would end up blocking a massive amount of wind flying on towards him. As Izuku would peer around the corner, he would stare towards Izumi before telling her she's going to need a lot more firepower than that to blow him out of this arena. Knowing this, she would rush up closer, flicking Izuku, or at least trying to, so the Guardian would be right there blocking her attack once again. Right as this would happen, Izuku would hop to Chastaful, standing on it, sort of like some sort of broom thing. As Izuku would be standing there, he would stare on towards Izumi, would use her legs, jumping up towards him, going for a punch. However, Izuku would dodge this. As he would end up falling back down, Izumi would continue her just barrage of punches, all of which would be quickly dodged by Izuku, who's quickly and easily maneuvering around the rapid punches of Izumi, tiring her out quite quickly. As all of these punches would be quickly just decreasing in momentum and power, Izuku would sense that Izumi was losing most of her stamina, and that this fight was coming to an end. As Izuku would end up seeing this, would end up jumping back, using Chastaful, guiding it around, slashing right across Izumi's cheek. Before, a power he had inherited from his father, King Disaster, would allow for this cut to quickly open up right into a massive gash, spewing blood out of it. As this knew that if she didn't forfeit the match within 5 minutes, she would likely bleed out. As this massive wound was huge, bigger than even Bakugo's one that he had suffered in the cavalry battle. As Midnight would look over towards the cement hero right across from her, basically with a questioning look as if they should cancel the fight or end it, he would give her a just shake of the head, signifying that Izumi wasn't done. She still had a fire in her eyes that said she wasn't going to give up just quite yet. Sensing this, Izuku, knowing she wasn't giving up, he would end up jumping backwards, laughing. I'm surprised you haven't given up already, he would say, cracking his knuckles, before jumping up, as Chastaful would go into its 5th form, increase, as a massive just army of these small spears, of basically smaller versions of Chastaful, would end up raining down over Izumi, and with the flick of Izuku's fingers, all of them would fall down right on top of her. As when the dust would settle, Izumi would be revealed to be standing there with her just arm completely broken, wobbling on both of her legs, barely managing to destroy all of them, or at least flick them away, if not destroy them. Chastaful would go back into its 1st form, as Izuku would look towards her. Quite impressive. You managed to eat my 5th form of Chastaful. That's quite more impressive than I thought you'd be able to do. But it's a shame. Your body's already given up on you, Izuku would say, looking towards her as she would fall back, falling onto her back as she would go unconscious, as Izuku would be awarded the victor, going on to the final round, where we end up cutting to the 2nd semi-finals, being Bakugo versus Todoroki, and this fight would go exactly like canon My Hero Academia, except instead of the finals, it would be the semi-finals, where Bakugo would be angered by Todoroki not using his fire, and would end up just completely destroying him, as Todoroki basically stood little chance if he wouldn't use his fire against Bakugo, as his ice would just completely be destroyed and massacred. So now we end up standing across from Izuku and Bakugo. Bakugo would glare daggers into Izuku. Izuku would only give a blank look right back. As the match would begin, Bakugo Izuku would both stare at each other for what seemed like hours before finally one of them would move. Chastaful would fly on towards Bakugo, as Bakugo would continue to evade all of Chastaful's quick swipes and attacks. However, Izuku was only moving his fingers, guiding Chastaful around the arena, so he'd continually go in for an attack after an attack, seemingly stopping out of nowhere and quickly changing directions. This would keep Bakugo on his toes, as Bakugo would end up having to increasingly dodge this before jumping right at Izuku, going in for an explosion, before Chastaful would end up blocking this explosion right with his second form, Guardian. It's a shame, Bakugo, Izuku would start off. Your explosions have little chance of affecting me. As long as this guy right here, Izuku would say, patting the Guardian's shoulder, is standing in front of me, there's absolutely no chance you can beat me, Izuku would say with an overconfident grin written all over his face. Bakugo would clench his hands in anger, looking on towards Izuku, before shaking off this anger. As if, I know you have a weakness, Izuku. Everyone does. Yeah, well, if everyone has a weakness, Bakugo, then your weakness is me, he would say, pointing towards his chest before going right towards Bakugo from nowhere and punching him right across the face, sort of an act that was unusual for Izuku. As Bakugo would end up stumbling backwards, holding his cheek, kind of caught off guard from the punch, would end up jumping towards Izuku before his wrist would be grabbed by the Guardian, as the explosion would be taken right into the chest of it. As the Guardian would stare on towards Bakugo, it would glare towards him before throwing him back, as Izuku end up staring at him, as he would end up turning Chastaful into his massive sunflower, so he would end up blooming, creating a massive just aura of destruction raining down right onto Bakugo. So Bakugo would stare up towards it in shock, completely just being consumed by it, as the crowd would end up cheering in excitement, just so in shock at the level of powers Uko had shown, and many of them would just chalk it up to being, yup, he's the son of All Might's, or he's All Might's son after all. There's no doubt about it. Both of them are so powerful, many of them would say to themselves. As Izuku would end up seeing the dust settle with Bakugo's unconscious body standing there, or rather sitting there completely unconscious, his UA uniform basically completely shredded by the sunflower, Chastaful would end up turning right back into a pillow, with Izuku grabbing it. We cut to see just the medal ceremony, with Bakugo having to be tied up. He wanted the fight to continue. He felt like he hadn't given his all yet, and that he still had some more left in him. However, the UA teachers and organizers knew that wasn't the case. He was done. There was no chance he was recovering from such a heavy loss like that. Plus, he was already injured from the cavalry battle, and just injuring him even more wasn't going to be good for his health. So Izuku would stand on top with a gold medal around his neck, as Bakugo would be in second, and Izumi, who would end up convincing Todoroki to use his fire, wouldn't even be on the podium at all, rather getting fourth and Todoroki in third. As Todoroki would be third, Bakugo in second, and Izuku in first. Izuku, the rest of his class, would be dismissed, where all of them would be congratulating the three of them for all placing on the podium, all of them being members of Class 1A, just showing how much more powerful Class 1A was than Class 1B. As we end up cutting and seeing Izuku walking back towards his house, where he would end up sitting down with his gold medal on a coffee table in front of him. His father would walk in just laughing. What a ray of power you showed out there. I'm quite impressed. Usually you take the easy way out and just use your most powerful attack right from the gate. I see you decided that strategy wasn't good enough for you now. You still haven't seen a fraction of my power, Dad. Isuke would say to his father, as his father would only laugh. We'll see about that during the final exams for your first year. And that is where part 3 of What If Deku Had King's Powers comes to an end. I hope you all did enjoy this part, and if you did, please consider subscribing, so it really does help this channel out, and you can even be notified when the other parts of this series do end up coming out. I thank you all for watching once again, and goodbye.